Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Kirsten. I'm responsible for marketing at GEP in Europe, and I will kick off things with introducing you to Graham. Graham, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. First, there was Brexit, then there was coronavirus, and now there's a war. The horsemen of the apocalypse seem to be arriving daily. So what's the world going to do, and what are supply chain professionals to do about it? Today, I'm joined by Natalie Henfrey, who is a leader at GEP who specialises in supporting our clients in their supply chain challenges. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how to fix some of these problems and some ideas and tactics you might use as a business leader. Hello, Natalie. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you, Graham.
Well, we'd love your comments in the chat, so we'll try and interact with you as we go. So please do that. GEP conducted some research which came out in November last year from the Economist Intelligence Unit. They interviewed 400 supply chain leaders. We're going to share with you some of the findings from that show the impact of all these unpredictable events. We're then going to talk to you a little bit about shifting supply chain strategies and what businesses are doing about it before trying to drive into some of the less obvious tactics and tips that Natalie and I have seen our clients trying to do. So that's what we're going to do today as an agenda. Let's talk first of all, Natalie, around the impact of all these events on supply chains. And let's go to the first slide, which talks about the factors that have had a significant impact. I don't think there's any surprises there, but what do you see has been the impact of the last few years on supply chains?
I think it's really interesting, actually. I think it's the unknowability of things. So this survey was conducted prior to the conflict in Ukraine, when COVID was top of everybody's minds. And I think we find that actually geopolitical problems feature fairly low down on the list there, if at all, actually. Which just goes to show that one of the biggest problems of our time was not in anyone's minds a year ago. And even maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, my clients were talking to me about inflation. That was their big problem for this year. You know, we're coming out of COVID and we're really, really worried about inflation. Then the conflict started, and now our clients are worried about inflation and the conflict, and actually inflation with conflict-related inflation. I think that what that says to us is we have to stay on our toes so we can provide the best advice, really, but also that really as a business you need to be prepared for absolutely anything and make sure that you're not overthinking what's around the corner because you don't know.
Yes, and let's look at looking backwards at what companies have suffered as a result of that lack of predictability. Let's look at the impact on profits based on this survey. The next slide shows a little bit of what the survey findings show around that, and what the impact's been more broadly. There's been damage to reputation, damage to other areas. What do you make of this, Natalie, in terms of what you're seeing as the impact that businesses have faced as a result of not being able to plan for these changes and these events?
Yeah, what I'm seeing is physical supply shortages, of course, which mean that people can't provide the products that they're known for. And what we're seeing, and again, it's reflected in this survey, is that that's partly it's got financial impact because it impacts cash flow, revenue, profitability, etc. But also the reputational side is really important. We're finding out that customers, they're not that brand loyal anymore, unless it's something really essential like a life-saving drug. But for consumer goods, brand loyalty is at an all-time low, and people are switching very quickly to somebody who can actually provide that product. And that's damaging reputation extremely badly, and you can't get that back. I mean, how do you say to your consumers, yeah, we got it wrong, we'll get it right next time, and have them trust you? I think that's a really difficult sell.
And the next question in the survey actually financially measures the consequences of some of those changes that customers have made as a result of lack of availability. What do you see here, Natalie?
I think the figures are interesting, but back to my previous point, it's how do you claw that back? Mm-hmm. Which is probably the biggest challenge right now, particularly when, we have these events coming and hitting us. It feels like, maybe it's old age, I don't know, but it feels like they're happening more and more often these days. So how do you actually bounce back from this as a business?
Yeah, businesses have moved from a long period of stability where they've been able to focus on cost efficiency and removing waste from supply chains. And strategies are now shifting in a world of greater uncertainty. So let's move on to look at what are businesses suggesting they're going to do on that. This slide shows is, according to the survey, businesses are recognizing for the first time that supply chain effectiveness is more important than cost management for the first time in a long time. Are you looking at the 4 questions here, Natalie? Is there anything from your perspective that is surprising or interesting from the point of view of changing and shifting approaches to supply chain risk?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I've been working in supply chain for a very long time and found that a lot of supply chain is driven by lean thinking, by having OEE as the great ruler of supply chain and many other things configured around your supply chain efficiency. Actually, in the current day and age, to be effective, we need to think differently about that. We do need to have some waste in the supply chain because, and I know we're going to talk about this later, but that becomes our buffer. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the interesting things. I think the other thing is thinking longer term. I feel that some of the changes we're having to make will be great from a sustainability point of view. So if we go back to the OEE example, where the production line was bad if it wasn't running continuously. If we think through the whole value chain for that, every demand generated to keep a production line running, normally stocked with things like your runners, generated some packaging being made. That might be a tree being cut down, or it puts another truck on the road. And I think if we're starting to think a little bit more about effectiveness and buffering the supply chain, we actually start to generate less demand, and that can only have a positive impact on the environment.
Yeah, just for the benefits of anyone who's listening in who's maybe not familiar, as you are with the topic, what does OEE stand for?
Operational equipment effectiveness, but please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. So it's really the measure of how well occupied and used your production line is.
Thank you. And you'll be pleased to know, Natalie, that you're obviously talking sense. Colin has commented, brand loyalty certainly depreciating. It's a very true statement and observation. Thanks for commenting, Colin. So the next point is around what's going to happen in the future. And just to go on to the next survey and the last part of the survey response that we're going to focus on today, this is the survey respondents' prediction of what the future events might impact them in the next 5 years. And the survey actually does show geopolitical events being the number one likely response. So obviously we have well-informed supply chain leaders. Is there anything else we would comment on there, Natalie? Or maybe it's fine. Maybe it's fine. And the important thing is when you look at company approaches to dealing with this uncertainty, let's talk about supply chain risk assessment. So what we observe is that the companies, very few companies have as we saw, good estimates of what's going to come up in the future, apart from these survey respondents. The blogger and cyber expert Bruce Snyder says we overreact to intentional actions and underreact to abstract events and natural phenomena. We overreact to things that offend our morals, and we overreact to immediate threats and underreact to long-term threats, and we underreact to changes that occur slowly and over time. And what that means, what that really demonstrates to me is that when you look at business threat management, and in procurement, we're behind some of the other functions in terms of risk management. If you were to look at the severity versus probability 2x2 matrices. I think that as a model is not working. It's people are hopeless at measuring severity, and they're hopeless at measuring probability, and so therefore I think that's a failing model, and that's why when you look at even the best reports from the World Economic Forum on risk, they didn't predict. It was in the top 5 risks, geopolitical conflict in Ukraine, for the Ukraine as a country, but it was nowhere near there as a global threat. Similarly, in 2019, infectious diseases didn't even make the top 10 of the World Economic Forum report on risk. So people were hopeless at guessing the future. So let's talk then about the supply chain risk assessment approach, where about half of companies have nothing at the moment, but those that do are able to respond better and recover more quickly. And that's what this diagram is showing. At the top, you'll see there a typical answer in terms of impact to a high damaging, unlikely event. And below, you'll see what happens if in the situation where a company has got proper supply chain risk management practices in place. It takes quicker to recover, and it'll have less impact. But there's quite a divide between companies that have this and companies that don't. And obviously, we advocate building stronger risk management practices at the heart of your supply chain. Let's talk about 3 tactics that could be used to address and improve your supply chain risk management practices.
Actually, I wanted if I might make a small comment on this slide, if that's okay.
Of course.
Yeah, I think what people become very fixated upon when they think about supply chain risk management is the event itself. They'll go and say, look, there's been a tsunami in the Far East, we need to protect ourselves against that. There's been a global pandemic, we need to protect against that, rather than thinking of these things in terms of events and thinking about how they protect their supply chain and invest in putting in SCRM just to deal with events. And I understand why they do it. It's because it's pretty difficult to go to your CFO, a hard sell to say, well, we need to have something in place because I think there is going to be, I don't know, a conflict in Ukraine, or, back to your earlier point about the predictability in 2019 of a global pandemic, and then be laughed out of the room. But we need to start, it makes supply chain risk management very reactive when we think in terms of events. What we need to think about is the structure and the process which surround it, and actually go to seek investment in it on that basis, rather than the fact we dealt badly with a tsunami 3 years ago. Which is much more typical.
Yes, yeah, I love that point, because what you have is a world where you tend to focus on the top right-hand box. But really what you need to do is explore all the possibilities and really focus on the ones where there's a high level of uncertainty. And that's the ones you need to start thinking about addressing, rather than focusing on one instance or one event. That's a great point. So back to 3 tactics, 3 tips. No, not at all. 3 tactics and tips that we want to advocate on behalf of supply chain professionals. And obviously, we're in a world of distress and shortage. The typical remedies would be something like find alternative sources, create buffer stocks, and try and bring your supply chain closer to home. But let's talk about some of the more unusual tactics that we're seeing in the market. We've picked 3: scenario testing, redundancy, and supply sensing. We're going to talk about these 3 things in order, and then we'll open it to Q&A. So let's introduce the first topic. So the World Economic Forum Risk Report, as you can tell, I'm a big fan. They talk about appreciating vulnerabilities in your wider ecosystem as a key organizational imperative to address risk. And I'm highlighting there in the middle that they talk about examining the resistance to shortfalls, outages, and delays of your third-party assets. What do you think about that, Natalie? In your experience, where are companies struggling to do that? What are your views on this one?
I think we're back to process here, and I think we're back to, well, nowadays we've got better tools, but just to reflect on my own career, I used to work in the supply chain of a major retailer, and we had off-site recovery operations if our supply chain ever failed and we couldn't place order with suppliers. This was probably 20 years or so ago. So forgive me if it sounds a bit old school, but basically we had some very good scenario management in place where we would have rehearsals for if our systems failed in an off-site area. It was, for example, if our head office burned down, our stock managers were all trained to be able to place purchase orders without using a system. So they all had calculators, printouts of current stock, and they could calculate what they needed to order using pen, paper, a calculator, and a set square. And we always had this threat hanging over us that one day the head of supply chain would wake us up in the middle of the night and we'd have to grab the manual we had to keep at home and go somewhere and practice. We never did it in the middle of the night, thank God. But actually one day our head office got struck by lightning and took out all of the power. And this was the day when we had to place orders of long distance deep sea wines coming from Australia and places for the Christmas market. So it was a really crucial day for us. And we lost our power, and then there was another lightning strike and our emergency generator got knocked out. But what we were able to do was our stock managers, because they were so well prepared, they got on their cars, they drove to the off-site place, placed all of the orders manually, and basically saved Christmas for us. But that's a very old school way of doing it, but it's effective. The point is we thought about what could happen and how we would deal with it. Now, nowadays, there are much better tools and systems. In ERP systems, you can have scenario bolt-ons. A lot of people use them anyway in IBP and S&OP. They're also there that they can be used in planning for these kind of problems. And I think what the usefulness is so you can improve communication around your supply chain. So you can practice, is there a standard message which we need to send out to our customers if this happens? What do we tell our suppliers? What do we do with our team? Who do we send home, etc.?
That's really fascinating, and well done for saving Christmas for all the wine drinkers out there. The interesting point for me is also about your views on business continuity planning as an obligation in contracts for your suppliers, and to what extent you see obligations being placed on supply chains, and whether you would advocate that as a good thing, or what you're seeing. How are businesses building resilience further down their supplier tiers?
I think they're not very good to it, especially with very critical suppliers. Even emerging 2 years of a pandemic, I've looked at some contracts recently across a number of companies, and it's sketchy. There are there are a lot of get out clauses. I think as procurement professionals, we're all familiar with the misuse of force majeure, which also gets in the way of having really good business continuity planning in contracts. But yeah, I think actually if you have reliance on a particular supply, then you should be doing that together. It should be part of your joint business plan, part of your standard supply development framework. But it's rare. It's rare to see it. I've probably seen maybe 3-4 examples over a 20-year career.
Well, I'm glad that we're advocating more of this today. Let's talk about the second tactic, redundancy. As I mentioned in the preamble to these 3 tactics, people often just think around, let's put more buffer stock around us, let's find some alternative suppliers. What do you think are the more interesting tactics that you can deploy around? We've put 7 up on the screen. Why don't you pick 1 or 2 that you think are intriguing or maybe interesting for the audience?
I think one of them I alluded to earlier, which is change your philosophy, move away from lean thinking into effective supply chain management, and stop having that as the kind of driver of your supply chain. I think having your backup supply, which I think covers a few of these boxes in terms of having regionalization or duplication. I think it's interesting to think strategically about that. I think sometimes it's quite challenging in terms of how you manage your supply base. So, the last thing you want if you have to move to your backup supplier is a supplier to turn around and say, well, you only gave me 20% of your volume last year. How come I've now got to give you 100%? So again, we're back to relying upon very good supplier management skills and actually starting to think more strategically about some of those suppliers who we may have dismissed as less important in the future. While you might only get 20% of your volume from them now, they still need to be treated like a highly important supplier to you, because sometimes you might need them.
That's fantastic. I like the concept of insurance, not in terms of financial insurance, but clearly the insurance industry exists to support high impact, low probability events that we all use as a collective. And I've seen some advocacy out there for companies collectively getting together to have a buffer of raw materials in their local community or in the local industrial park, even if they're not competing, but to provide a bit more surety of supply in the event of, as an insurance, in the event of one of you needing it. I quite fancy that one as a different way of thinking about your supply chain, looking at your neighbours in the region or in the place that your factories are. That's awesome, Natalie. Is there anything else? Shall we go on to supply sensing?
Let's do that.
So this is our final tactic that we think is interesting. The Economist survey did ask what technological and digital investments are companies making across Europe and in North America around addressing this disruption. And the top of the list were activities that drive better collaboration and communication with vendors to get more interactivity about when things are going to be late or on time, and also to drive better forward-looking viewpoints. What are you seeing happening in the world of supply chain, Natalie?
I think for many years we've shared information with suppliers. We've had vendor schedules where we've asked for confirmation every week that things will be delivered, and it's manual. I think sometimes it gets overlooked. Unless people have invested in really good tools where it's easy for a supplier to click and say, yes, I'll send that. Sometimes it's still a very manual process, and it gets easily overlooked, and it doesn't get done basically because it's, let's face it feels like a thankless task. And that means that when that happens, everyone gets out of the rhythm of doing that until it's too late to realise that actually a crucial supply isn't going to be with you in 6 weeks when it's coming from China or somewhere like that. I think one of the enablers of this, though, supply sensing, is making sure you've got one version of truth flowing up and down the supply chain, which means having much tighter S&OP processes than maybe a lot of businesses do, and then making sure that you're enabling your supply chain to see the information, and bearing in mind that some of your critical suppliers who produce that tiny widget, which is really, really crucial to you, might not be big. They might not be able to invest in fancy systems. So you actually have to give some serious thought to how you can be inclusive with managing supply sensing really well. And that might mean investing in a slightly older system than you would like to do because it's affordable for your suppliers.
Very interesting. And that S&OP is sales and operational planning, is it? I'm just for the audience.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
I just wanted to make sure for those who maybe aren't specialists in the subject. That's fantastic. I think just to summarize then what we're saying, we covered off there's been a big impact in terms of business cost, profit, reputation from the last few years. Businesses remain struggling to shift their strategies and are looking at new ways of moving from a cost-focused supply chain to a more secure one. And people are floundering on how to do that. And we're offering a few tactics there and approaches to, as you move that strategy, you should consider supply sensing, redundancy, and scenario testing more in your supply chain, as well as the more traditional levers. Let's move to Q&A and see if anyone in the audience has anything they would like to ask Natalie, or indeed myself, although I would probably say Natalie's more of the expert on this than me. So here, we've got one here. How, Natalie, would you suggest, if you're buying, actually, I'm just going to preamble, in Russia, big exporter of gas, fertilizer, nickel, Ukraine, wheat, neon, shipping stopped for those countries. It's hard to get goods out. So how do you manage, if you're buying from those markets, how do you manage shortages and inflation from these markets? What are the tips and tactics you can offer somebody struggling to get hold of goods or get them at a good price in the short term?
I think the answer actually lies outside of supply chain for this one. What I would be doing is working with the marketing team to say, how do we temporarily shrink our portfolio? So we're focusing on where we can get the materials, where we can be profitable, and just moving the range down to be a lot more concentrated in the short term till we're over this crisis. So focus on your profitable products and ones where you can get materials at an acceptable price.
Very interesting. So that really puts supply chain at the front end of the business, in the sense that you might have to restrict choice to keep your business running.
Yeah, and I think we saw a little of that during the early days of the pandemic, where there was a big run in the UK on buying pasta. Do you remember that? And saw a number of supermarkets and manufacturers actually start to reduce down the offer from being 20 different shapes of pasta to being 4 or 5. Yeah, I know it's a real first world problem, but we have seen supply chains operate effectively in that way before. And I think that's possibly one way of dealing with the current issue.
Well, when I think of the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse we've had pestilence in coronavirus, we've had famine through pasta and toilet roll shortages, and now we have war. There's only nuclear. We've only got death left. Let's just hope it doesn't get there. So are there any more questions coming in? I don't see any more, but we'll just where does GEP products and services? Well, I'll save that for where do our products and services stand in all of this? So I'll close with that. Let's talk briefly about GEP. We are a supply chain specialist. We've got 5,000 staff around the world helping businesses solve their procurement and supply chain dilemmas. If you have found this an interesting conversation and you want to talk more about your supply chain challenges, we have advisory services and managed services and software that supports the greater efficiency and risk management of these things. Natalie, if someone wanted to talk about supply chain anywhere in the world, wanted to talk about some of their supply chain issues, where would you recommend they get in touch?
Probably through LinkedIn as a first point of contact, unless you're going to tell me otherwise, Graham.
No, that sounds good to me. Come to myself or Natalie if you'd like to talk about any of your supply chain issues. If you're struggling with any shortages or inflation, or wanting to get your hands around how to better plan and put in place better supply chain risk management technologies and tools and operating model. We have another question. Material scarcity, insufficient inputs, they've all been a major concern since the pandemic began due to an abrupt rise in consumer demand. That is true. What are our thoughts on these? What are your thoughts, Natalie, on material scarcity? Anything else you can add on that based on what you've heard?
I think longer term, if you've got material scarcity, the strategy may be to look for alternatives and do some kind of manufacturing re-engineering, assuming it's a manufacturing company, to see if you can make your product differently without impacting the quality, etc. I think the other sort of more medium term tactic worth investing in is to actually get better at supply chain collaboration and make sure that you and your supplier are doing scenario testing together, that you have the right kind of supplier stocks available to you when needed.
Very interesting. Yeah, it just shows the strategic importance of supply chains to many businesses. That you'd have
not just your internal supply chain, actually. I think I've seen an estimate that 80% of the information about your supply chain sits outside of it. So it might be information that's held by shipping agents, etc. So actually, to get the best information to enable you to run your supply chain, you need to be thinking about, who do you collaborate with to make sure you've got all of that information, and what systems do you need? And that visibility is the thing that's really going to help you.
We've got a question there that I can probably try and answering, but welcome your support. How is our customers' behaviour changing due to the pandemic, and is it different from the rest of the world? I'm going to assume that's asking about our GEP customers. We work generally with billion-plus companies and Fortune 500 companies who are wrestling with challenges around their supply chain resilience and about their procurement operating model every day. How do you think our customer requirements have changed? I'm seeing a growing emphasis on sustainability, which should ultimately bring down some of the costs and inflation on some of these energy struggles that we have. But I'm also seeing a great focus on security of supply at the moment. How do you think it's changed since the pandemic, Natalie, from your perspective? What our customers are looking for?
Yeah, I think it is about security of supply, but at the right cost. Because of course you can secure supply at huge cost to yourself, but it's starting to draw on more strategic supply management again, but also improving as negotiators to make sure we're getting better pricing, making sure that your procurement team can negotiate away requests for price rises linked to inflation, for example, and making sure they've got the data to give data-driven arguments back. So we all know inflation's a problem, and I don't want to be dismissive of it at all, but I have seen recently some supplier demands come in for asking for around about 20% as an inflationary increase, and that's just way too much. It doesn't reflect reality. So again, if you can counter that argument with what's really going on in the world and make sure people are well informed about it, then you'll be maybe managing your cost base better than some other companies.
You sparked me realizing that a third emerging demand is that thirst for data to make sure that any impactful inflationary events or shortages are can be forecast more readily, or at least in the face of them, that you can do a should cost model that allows you to judge whether you're getting a fair deal. And I think that desire for data to look at cost drivers, to look at indices, that's definitely in the last months as well. Let's take one more question and then we'll wrap up. What is the current demand of customers in the UK region for S2C, S2P, P2P, and where is GEP focusing in these areas? Well, let's just break down those acronyms for those who maybe aren't specialists. S2C, source to contract, so that's negotiating, finding, scouting for suppliers to meet requirements that you've helped develop. Source to pay would be looking at all those things and then managing a transaction through to payables. And P2P is the bit of between having placed a contract to placing the order and then getting it invoiced and paid to the supplier. So what is the current demand of customers in the UK region for S2C, S2P and P2P? I would say that the market for managed services has had a bit of a hammering in previous years, but actually there's been a resurgence in the last 2 or 3 years as people have realized that virtual working allows you to be based anywhere. And therefore you don't need to have a high cost team sat in somewhere like the UK necessarily to do all your work. So we've seen a resurgence in requirements and to look at managed services. From an advisory perspective, the advisory market for supporting businesses in S2C, S2P and P2P continues to be buoyant. It's been a market that's grown for decades. It's a profession that continues to have focus, and these crises have only enhanced the demand for the skills of supply chain and procurement professionals. It's a great time, if a challenging time, to be a supply chain or procurement professional, but you like us, are in demand as a result. So I'm going to propose to, actually we've got one last question, one final one. Nitya Ashish, thank you for the question. She's curious if vendor managed inventory or VMI buffer is helpful as an instrument for risk management around something like PVC, I think, as a material. What do you think of that, Natalie?
I think there's a couple of things. I think, yes, with the right controls and balances on to make sure that you are getting what you expect when you hand over that level of trust to the supplier, because it's unlikely that you're the only customer, and we all want to be customer of choice, don't we, in that situation? So I think you need to have the right infrastructure around that. And I think the other thing is not just thinking of the PVC, but if you have resins involved in production, you also need to think about master batch, because sometimes that, thinking along the value chain, two things like master batch, because sometimes that is a bit more difficult to get hold of.
Fantastic answer, Natalie. Thank you. And thank you, Natalie, for your wisdom and insight today. If you want to know more, please contact myself and Natalie. We're available. Contact us on LinkedIn, as Natalie suggests. Thank you for engaging with us over the course of this webinar today. Really appreciated the questions that we received. And thank you for joining, and good night.